And I'd like to use these three fairy tales to demonstrate the descriptions of the archetypal elements, self and shadow, ego and soul, feminine and masculine, that I previously gave. In the case of the agency of self and shadow, the fairy tale, The Two Travelers, or sometimes called The Two Wanderers, is a good one to choose to demonstrate exactly how the self and shadow are often constellated. Now, this story involves two characters, one a cobbler and another a tailor. Well, the cobbler is concerned about his future and tends to be greedy and deceptive, while the tailor is kind of a happy-go-lucky character, not very concerned with his future and basically generous. These two meet on the road, and where there is first a friendly companionship leads to the cobbler wronging the tailor when the tailor, due to his happy-go-lucky nature, finds himself in distress. But eventually they both come to a town where they earn the employment under the king. Now, the cobbler, as is his nature, is jealous and uses his deceptions to convince the king that the tailor means him to do him ill. And the king, believing this, decides to put the tailor to 3 trials so that he can prove himself worthy to be with the king. Now, in many cases, people would look at this story constellation and decide that the self and shadow are represented by the dichotomy of the tailor and the cobbler. But as is noted in the writings of Maria Louise von Franz, the life of the king often is used to depict the transition from self to shadow. The prince, as an ego, becoming king, represents the highest expression of self, but as the rule of the king progresses and grows old, the shadow emerges. So we can say that the king constellated with the tailor represents the self, and the king constellated with the cobbler represents the shadow. And making it more obvious that the king constellated with the tailor represents the self is that through the 3 trials, the tailor manifests the king receiving a child, which him and the queen had not been able to produce until the agency of the tailor, and therefore representing the possibility of renewal for the kingdom and the passing away of the old king as shadow and the new prince that comes through the agency of the tailor as renewal. Now, if we look at the agency of ego and soul, and we look at the story The Princess's Lost Hair, in this story, the princess, who has beautiful hair and is beautiful and admired by all the kingdom and held with pride and preciousness by her father, the king, has an interaction with a divine bird, and in being selfish, is cursed with the loss of her hair. And of course, the king, identifying with the princess as being representative of all that is good in his kingdom by her beauty, decides that he needs to call all his magicians and ministers together to try to figure out what to do about the loss of her. But none of them know themselves what to do. They're all at a loss. And so one thing that makes this particular African fairy tale good representation is that the princess has a dream. And in the dream, the princess divines that there is a special tree, which you may call a her tree, on which her grows. And it also bears fruit, that then out of the fruit grows her, and bears seeds that will allow you to grow such trees which bear such fruit. And through this, she knows by virtue of the dream that her hair can be restored. Now, in many cases, the princess representing the soul force, in this case, has learned in her dreams what is necessary to be able to journey. So in many cases, the princess is passive, and does not provide this essential role as the learning to journey agency in the story, but it is very clear in this story that it's through her dreaming that what is necessary to go on the journey is brought to consciousness. And so then an ego force, who is not actually a prince but a commoner, who even has a flawed leg, comes and goes on the journey. And through the journey is able to discriminate how to find the king through various interaction with supernatural forces, and finds himself in the land where the hair tree grows, and is able to get seeds and returns with them, and grows the hair, which then is restored to the princess, so that the ego and the soul are now engaged and married. Now, the next story, Briar Rose, is a good story to look at in terms of understanding the agency of the feminine and masculine, as I have talked about, as being integrating to learn and discriminating to learn. And in the one case, integrating to learn leads to learning to discriminate. And the second case of masculine, discriminating to learn, leads to learning to integrate. In the story of Briar Rose, of course, we have where fairy godmothers are all invited, but one is excluded. And that exclusion is the beginning of a breaking of a natural order of things. And so the excluded fairy godmother, then we know, curses the princess whose birthday it was. And in other versions of this story, instead of 13 fairies, we have goddesses. And there are 3 goddesses, and one of those goddesses, the one that is excluded, is usually Themis, which is a goddess of justice, showing that the actions of Themis, or the fairy godmother, are actions of justice, righting a wrong, setting things as they should be, reintegrating, making possible a reintegration. So what happens is that the princess then falls asleep with the whole household, and it has been decreed that it should be for 100 years, and so that all the ego forces, the princess that come before the 100 years has passed, find that they can find no interest, and many die in the briars. It is only when things have come to pass, when the proper cycles of things has happened, that this reintegration can take place. A prince arises on the day that the decree has passed and is able to pass through the briars without resistance, and goes in and wakes up the princess and the whole household, and the land is now reintegrated by virtue of that feminine force, not the masculine force, because the prince in this case makes no effort that achieves the awakening of the princess or the reintegration of the kingdom. And so there we have, through these three stories, examples of the descriptions of self and shadow, ego and soul, and feminine and masculine, as I have suggested.